Today's class will focus on nudges or nudging. I'll explain what nudges are. I will explain how you go about nudging. I will give, I think, a decent number of examples. And then after that, I'll discuss. I guess after that, I will kind of let you go um, to think about it and then um, also create or review the final project with you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started.
So when we talk about nudges, according to the book that we read, a nudge would be considered any aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way. And I think we need to really focus on this, right? So when you nudge someone, you have a predictable action or behavior that you expect from that nudge. And we also don't expect any options to be forbidden or economic incentives or incentives to be changed from a nudge, right? So in the book, they talk about liberal paternalism, this idea that you can push people without necessarily blocking their choices or taking away their incentives to do so. When I think about nudges, I think of nudges as the facilitation of choice, right? Helping people make choices. We get nudged all the time, right? Some are somewhat deliberate. Um, so, for example, in this picture that I show on this slide, Homer Simpson is being nudged to eat fresh fruit instead of donuts, right? Because they put fresh fruit near the cash register, right? My cunning choice architecture will soon have Homer eating healthy. On the other hand, you can think of other pushes or nudges that aren't as blatant. So, for example, I know when you sign up for classes, usually you are able to sign up at a certain time, right? So, when I was at Mizzou, at least, they would give a specific time for freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors to sign up for classes for the next semester. And that essentially is a push. It's a nudge, right? It gets you to sign up for classes. It doesn't take away your incentive the ability to sign up for classes. You can always sign up later. Um, but it does kind of allow people or push people to sign up for classes at a certain time so that Mizzou at that time could figure out kind of what the expectations were for each course load or class size, this type of thing. You could also think about how you get pushed by stores, right? So when you get 19 emails from Sephora or 34, 37, how many ever they send, those are nudges. You can think about how your parents nudge you to do certain things. So I can remember when I was a kid, my mom nudged us quite a bit to clean up the house. She's a bit of a neat freak, which is probably why I'm not. But nudges happen everywhere. You nudge people, people nudge you, companies nudge you. Sometimes you nudge companies. Nudges are just a fact of life. That said, I will say one thing that did happen last semester is that I think I kind of had a few students a little paranoid about nudges. Hopefully, nudges don't penalize you, so there should be nothing to really be paranoid about. So, one thing that becomes pretty important when we're talking about nudges is this idea of choice architecture. And choice architecture is just how you design choices, right? How choices are presented to consumers. And hopefully, if you're designing choices correctly, if you're a good choice architecture, you are nudging consumers, right? So, I talked about in class this idea that if you were designing a ballot, research shows that consumers tend to pick the first choice on the ballot. This might not necessarily be true if you know who you're voting for, which most people do when they go in for president, for example, when you're voting for who you'd like to be president of the United States. But when you get down to things like judges in the local county or state treasurers, if you're not as familiar, most people will just choose the first choice on the ballot. And if that's the case, then whoever is designing that ballot really is a choice architect. Um, if you're a doctor and you're describing alternative treatments to patients, right? So you can take this pill, but the drawback of this pill is that, it makes you sleepy or fatigued. On the other hand, you can just try medication that doesn't do that, but it has another side effect, so on and so forth. The way the doctor presents information to you is a bit of a choice architecture, and the doctor in that case is a choice architect. If you design new forms that employees fill out, if you're a parent and you're describing educational options. So I was at a conference once, and a pretty famous person from a pretty good school talked about how she helped design the refill request for Walgreens, the pharmacy. And the request would say something like, yes, please continue to keep my refills coming, as the case with my prescription, or no, I don't think I need refills. And so the person who was filling out the form had the option to click either box. Of course, when you say please keep my refills coming as the doctor prescribed, most people will go ahead and say yes, I want Walgreens to continue to fulfill my prescription or fill my prescriptions, as opposed to no, I don't think I need any more of this medication. That person who designed that really, or persons I should say, are choice architects, and they're engaging in choice architecture.
Before I go further into discussing nudges, I want to discuss the topic of Homo economicus. This phrase is meant to literally translate into economic man. And according to the literature, an economic man, or Homo economicus, is this idea that we all are rational beings, right? We are all rational persons who pursue wealth for his or her own self interest, right? So, I mean, honestly, if we're thinking rationally, I think one can make a pretty strong argument for why the most rational thing for a person to do, particularly under, let's say, capitalism, is to pursue wealth for his or her own self interest. Spock is a great, if you've ever watched Star Trek, one of the main characters from the original series was Spock. Spock um, was a Vulcan, and he was extremely rational because Vulcans are extremely rational people. But Spock is a perfect example of why Homo economicus doesn't really hold. Spock is extremely rational, right? One of the most rational beings that ever existed, right? However, what Spock didn't do was he didn't pursue wealth for his own self interest. There are a lot of reasons not to do that, but for a lot of people, they think about other people, right? We are kind of built to do that. Whether those other people are our families, our friends, people that are in our circles, people that are outside of our circles, right? How many of us give to charity or volunteer, or, any number of things that you can do that aren't necessarily the most beneficial for you, but are beneficial for the common good, right? Or just some level of good. According to Homo economicus, we wouldn't be doing that, right? So why would I hear about a tsunami or a flood or a hurricane and send money to the Red Cross or whatever organization you choose to send money to, or Gleaners in Detroit? Why would you take money that belongs to you, that you've worked for, and send it to these organizations? A lot of times it's because you want to help other people, right? You kind of empathize with their plights, and a lot of us understand that it could also be us. But that's not really the most economic thing we can do. It's not the most rational thing that we can do. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that although the theory sounds good, it's not one that really holds up to scrutiny for most people most of the time. Not that it never holds up for people. Like, we all have ways and reasons where we really do pursue our own self-interest. I just don't think that's always the norm, and it's consistent enough. And I know for a fact I'm not the only person who believes this to be true. I mean, you can think about it yourself and think of many ways in which you may or may not be the most rational. I mean, I think a lot of people would argue, if you go to a university, and we see people arguing this all the time, that everyone should get a STEM degree. Not everybody's going to be great at STEM, but not everybody wants to do STEM. And the fact of the matter is, we need people who don't do STEM, right? We need people who decide to be teachers. You need a history teacher, you need a geography teacher, you need people at K through 12 who can do those things. We need musicians, we need artists, we need an entire body of people, and they can't all be the exact same people. However, I think people could probably make a pretty rational argument. Oh, you should be a STEM major. And I think an even stronger argument can be made that not everybody should be a STEM major. But, moving on. I'm laughing to myself because I just butchered this slide and had to start over. Okay, so assumptions of the standard economic model, this idea of Homo economicus, is that people act with full information. I mean, how can you be rational if you don't have all of the information, right? It could be that the most rational thing for us to do is just use bikes and not buy a car because, the amount that they charge is significantly more than it costs for the car to be built, or because technically you can't really afford the Lexus that you purchased, or the BMW that you purchased, or even the Corolla that you purchased. Another assumption is that people have known preferences, so you know everything there is to know about yourself, to the point where you can say without a doubt that you prefer X and you'll never prefer Y, right? So when you buy your Corolla, you have to assume that you really love, or you know yourself enough to know that you're purchasing the Corolla because you really like the Corolla. But, at the end of the day, how many of us purchase things confident that we liked X, and then it turns out we don't actually like X because we find out something new about ourselves, right? Like, oh, I actually really would prefer an SUV, or oh, it turns out I don't want to keep this car for 6 years because I'm gonna have a family in 3 years, right? I plan on having children, and or you could say something like, I'll never have kids, so it's fine for me to get this 2-door coupe, and then change your mind 3 years later and decide to have kids, and then, not to be judgmental, but it's really not great to put a baby in a coupe because you really need to put a baby in the back seat, and a 2-door coupe doesn't typically, I'm not saying always, but typically doesn't have a 2-door, or doesn't have a back seat. So you have to know that you won't change your mind, and you know exactly who you are. And I don't know about the rest of you, but that's a hard row to hoe for myself. I'm not young, but I'm still learning about myself, I would say, on a regular basis. And then you have to assume that people will choose the best option available, right? This idea of a rational choice. So I can give you some examples. There are tons of people who are buying the Tesla SUV. And I think we could make a strong argument, or at least I think many people could, myself included, that it might not be the best vehicle based on what I've seen on TikTok, and some of the damages that have happened to the vehicle, right? Like the grill falling off, or the bumper falling, like, you can't roll down the windows. It doesn't do so well over terrain. But I actually read an article the other day that was really interesting, and it was saying that the type of people who buy this car, this Tesla over SUV, are the type of people who are okay with having small or even not so small issues with their car, right? They just are okay with that. Now, for me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I am the type of person who has only ever purchased a used car, has only ever purchased a car that I plan on having for at least 10 years. So I want a car that I think will last at least 10 years, right? And that doesn't actually work for a lot of people. And that's the other thing to remember, that not everything works for everybody. Our preferences are going to be different. Our tolerance levels are going to be different. Our level of risk acceptance and okay I guess, with risk, right? So I personally am fairly risk averse. And so for me, the Tesla SUV is not the most attractive of cars. Um, for that reason. I am extremely risk averse. I can give you story after story. I've always been risk averse. And so it just doesn't work for me. However, if you are more likely, if you're more okay with risk, I could see maybe why you would buy that car. And so we have to think about all of those things. I can give you some examples in my life. I think I can't remember if I mentioned this in my About Me video, but I am a professor. I've gone through years and years of schooling. And when I was in high school, I went through AP and IB courses, right? So I took the more difficult classes. But I still never had any intention of going to college, right? College just was not on my radar. It wasn't something I really wanted to do. I knew for a fact that when high school ended, I was pretty much gonna, at the very least, take a break, right? I needed at least a 5 year break. It just wasn't for me. And yet here I am, right? When I decided to pursue my PhD, one of the things that I don't know if any of you are interested, but if you decide to pursue your PhD, one of the things they will tell you is to apply broadly, particularly in business, because most business schools don't take a lot of students. I ended up going to the University of Arkansas. I was a cohort of one. The year before me, they had also taken one person, and the year after me, they took no students. A lot of programs just do not regularly take a lot of students, so they might be taking one or two students. Programs that take more students, I'll give you an example in marketing. Duke will regularly take about 5 students. They assume at least two of them won't make it through the program, right? So it's just not that big of, it's just not, they're just not big programs. Um, anyway, I applied to, I think, 12, maybe 15 schools because you just never know. And I did pretty well. I got into a decent number of those schools, and you go and you do the campus visit, yada yada yada. And I actually got accepted into some schools that were better than the University of Arkansas, but they were also just really much more cutthroat. And after leaving corporate America, I knew that I just didn't want to be in that environment. I didn't want to have to walk into the building and watch my back, right? Like, who's trying to get me? On the other hand, I walked into the University of Arkansas and I met the people, and they all felt like friends immediately. And I was like, this is the place I want to be at, right? And so some people will say that's not the most rational choice. And in fact, a school told me that I was making a big mistake. It was the wrong decision. But I made a decision. I just went with more my heart. And I think we all make those kind of decisions. Sometimes you go with your gut. Sometimes you go with your heart. Sometimes you do the any, mini, money, mo method. We all have our ways of making decisions, and they aren't always, connecting the dot from A to B. Sometimes you go from A to F to Y, back to Q, right? Who knows? But, it's not always the most rational.
So one issue with nudges is that some people have some objections. Let's be clear. So some people will say things like everyone will make the right decision for themselves. And in theory, that's true. Everyone will make the right decision for themselves. However, consumers tend to be what they call predictably wrong. One, and there are a lot of reasons. I talked about biases in class. I'll continue to talk about biases in class, particularly next week and the week after when we're talking about judgment, decision making, and attitudes. But there are a couple of things that I can talk about right now, like the planning fallacy, right? And in a lot of cases, we plan to do certain things, but we never actually do them. We tend to lean towards status quo a lot. Whatever is originally happening or happening right now, we tend to just stick with that. And so that affects our ability to make good choices for ourselves. And then how we perceive events, how we perceive situations, how we perceive products might also affect our choice. And so sometimes we don't actually make the best decision for ourselves. Another objection that can come up for nudges is this idea that the more choices, the better. Um, And this isn't actually always true. One, in some cases, if you have a experience with the choices that are provided, then more choices aren't better. If you lack certain information about said choices, then more choices aren't better. And then if we don't have feedback about the choices that we might make, some choices aren't better, right? So, for example, you could think of test as a form of feedback. If you sign up for a Calc 3 class, Calculus 3, and you make an F on the first test, that might be a form of feedback to let you know maybe that's not a good choice for you. There's also research that suggests that consumers in general just get overwhelmed by choices. Actually, there's a really famous book, and he demonstrates this with a pair of jeans, believe it or not. And he shows that when there were only two or three pairs of jeans on the shelf, most consumers can make a pretty good choice. But now, when you go into the mall or you go in a store and they have 50 pairs of jeans, most people can't really kind of comprehend how to make decisions between each one of those pairs of jeans. They get overwhelmed. Some people will make a bad choice, some consumers will make no choice, so on and so forth. But influencing people is always unavoidable, particularly if you're a retailer or the government. We tend to influence people. Heck, you influence people, right? When you give answers in class, the clothes you wear, the things you say, we just tend to influence others' choices. Um, when you influence people's choices, that isn't always coercion, but it can be. I mean, let's just be honest, it absolutely can. But again, we are always keeping in mind the freedom of choice. We do not want to block a consumer's ability or freedom to choose, and that is not at all what choice nudges are about.